the highest aim in individual life and in political life is love. And the civic manifestation of that is the common good and life in common. And it's not the atomized individual. So this means forming bonds, building relationships, and sustaining them over time. This lifestyle of rootless autonomy required for this conception of modernity and endless consumption, it's really inimical to this deeper form of connection. And so I think people discover that through intellectual encounters or their own encounters with thicker, deeper traditions of thought and their manifestation in community. I think people will become open to that.
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
Our guest today is Peter Copeland. Peter's an author, blogger, speaker, and he's currently the Deputy Director of Domestic Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Welcome,
Sean,
Peter.
thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate you being here. So we're looking at an election, probably federally this spring, but also now provincially in Ontario. And in Canada, we get to choose between Conservatives, Liberals, and the New Democratic Party. But a lot of people wonder, what exactly do the Conservatives stand for? I was wondering if you could help unpack that for us. What do you think about the election? What do you think about conservative? What does that label mean? What is conservatism?
Great question, Sean. I think there has been a fair degree of consistency in conservatism in Canada and maybe even the Anglosphere more broadly. But there's definitely a shift going on now, maybe being underway for the past couple decades. I'd say that in Canada, conservative roughly means classical liberal with influences of libertarianism and social conservatism. Classical liberal, kind of a neutral state, small government, preserving freedom, degree of equality. It's kind of claims to be non-interventionist in people's lives, places great emphasis on independent courts and rule of law, these sorts of things, emerged in Europe and in particular in England, kind of with John Locke and subsequent thinkers. More of a heavy emphasis on freedom and smaller states. Some people who hold those views emphasize economic freedom more, others social. And in social conservatism, more of a preference for order, history belonging to a tradition, things like the natural law, so that there being kind of values being inherent to our nature, and that certain things kind of flow from it. We don't kind of make them up ourselves. We discover them in each. But conservatism, it's kind of an odd thing in that it's liberal. Really, in the Anglosphere, it's conserving this liberal tradition, which is kind of this inherently dynamic focus on individual freedom and growth and development that stems from that. But in Canada, as opposed to the US, for example, we're not as big on raw freedom here, and we have more of a go along to get along approach, highly pragmatic. Yet our conservative groups are also interested in smaller government. It's also, I think, in Canada concerned with preserving peace, status quo, in the modus vivendi. And we get this from our peace, order, good government motto and our British roots. And this has been changing a little bit in past decades. We'll get more into this later, but there's more of an interest now in working class voters and kind of the rootedness, maybe more social conservative influence. And there's actually a great tension, I would say, right now. And we're kind of at a crossroads somewhat, where to go.
So just before we jump into the shift, because I'm glad you mentioned that, and we certainly see that south of the border a lot, but I would like to unpack it in Canada as well. Just before we leave the different groups of ideas within conservatism, I'm wondering, do you sense any difference between the libertarians and the classical liberals and the traditional conservatives with respect to what they think about first principles? So certainly on outcomes, they seem to all like maximizing freedom, maximizing liberty, or at least within an ordered society. Do you sense any difference in the way they think about humans, for example? One theme is that humans are like a lump of plasticine, and we can mold them into whatever they want to be, and they're going to get better and better and better forever. Whereas another strain is to say, no, actually humans can be dangerous, and maybe we should not think that they're going to be improvable and
Mhm.
and that they're going to get better and better.
Let me just get into a lot of trouble and point out the sharp edges of disagreement. No, there's certainly a lot of agreement here, but some very important differences. Yes, starting with conception of human nature and the ethical implications that flow from that. I think libertarians and classical liberals are much more of the view that it's shapeable, moldable. Maybe norms are more socially constructed, although that's not really a term they would use so much. And freedom is really fundamental, and everyone's unique. So you need to give people free rein to pursue their own vision of the good life. And social conservatives, more traditional ones, would say that it's more circumscribed by nature. And I think because of this, we have differences about the role of the state and what should be allowed and what shouldn't be. Generally speaking, libertarians, classical liberals think you should be less prescriptive in that regard, and social conservatives think you should be more prescriptive. And it also shakes out in the size of the state question, even the extent to which market and choice and freedom should be constrained. So those are some big differences.
Yeah. So, and that maybe segues into your comments about a shift, because it seems like we could have fusion, right? Fusionism, the big term from the 1980s and 90s, where the traditional conservatives and the libertarians and the classical liberals all fused together in favor of small governments, free markets, maximizing freedom, that sort of thing. It seems like the society, at least in the last 10 years, especially in Canada, with changes in the euthanasia laws, transgenderism, safe supply, all these social issues, and I don't particularly want to get into the social issues, but to get into the ideas behind them. And I find my libertarian friends, and I considered myself a libertarian at one time until fairly recently, they're struggling now with, well, wait a second, guys. Yeah, we want people to do whatever they want, but we never thought they would do that. Do you find some of our fellow travelers on this right of center group starting to look around for signposts or something to hang on to? Guardrails is maybe a better word.
Yeah, let me go back to classical liberalism, its features, and I think maybe where it leads. Not with strict necessity, but I think the more you emphasize its key features at the exclusion of other values, it leads to kind of dissolution, permissiveness, rudderlessness, aimlessness. So in this, maybe even the classical political science vision of the world that sees things in terms of government size and spending, programming, rule of law, international institutions, it's all processes and institutions and policies. It kind of completely brackets the question of culture and values. And in any case, I think there's a story of the world that might be the centrist one, you could say, that says we are what we are because we have relatively open societies that welcome investment, people, goods, keep taxes fairly low, and our finances in good order, government relatively small. And we just need to butt us with the equal application of the rule of law, and all will be well and continue to improve. But I think just to reinforce that previous point about the bracketing, it just leaves out so many other things out of the equation as if they don't exist, so kind of blind. And I would say that they're more fundamental than these things and are required for a healthy society. This view that kind of sees classical liberalism, its elements as like cut and paste processes and institutions that you can measure, it's grown out of a much thicker culture upon which it's parasitic. Even, and I think it ends up undermining this cultural basis over time through an overemphasis on freedom, choice, these sorts of things. I think because classical liberalism increasingly provides freedom as it bases itself on a neutral state that's supposed to act as this referee, and it assumes the sovereign, autonomous individual and self-creation as primary foundational values. This actually goes hand in hand with recognizing the quality of all the different choices made by people. Because if they're all the product of the fundamental value, sovereign, autonomous choice, then they must be approved in some way. Over time, this has led directly to the growth size of government because it leads to more and more rights that guarantee a person's ability to do, say, and be whatever they want, or at least removal of legal prohibitions on things. This has both a balkanizing and disintegrating effect on society if people don't share values. And certainly I would say not all choices are good, not even close.
Can I jump in? Yeah, no, because you're going in a direction that I want to chase down as well with the issue of rights and sort of procedures and a neutral proceduralism. But you mentioned that classical liberalism assumes a thicker view of society, I think, the way you said it. And so I've often called liberalism a fairly thin political philosophy. And in many ways, that's its strength, right? It's simple. We're just going to focus on rule of law, limited government, free enterprise, and let people do what they want to do. But I wanted to circle back to your comments about a shift in what people are thinking about or what conservatism is, at least in Canada. It seems to me that some of the emphasis on all choices being the same and all we need is lower taxes and more freedom and more free enterprise is leaving many conservative voters, at least in the last 10 to 15 years, saying, wait a second, I like these ideas, but I can't get a job now. Or I like these ideas, but I can't find a house. And so it seems like there's a bit of a shift back or a shift away from some of those sort of standard classical liberal, libertarian, free market, small government type of ideas. Now, is that just me observing this, or what are your thoughts on that? Because you mentioned shift.
Yeah, so I think the reason why it's having disintegrating effects, which are being felt in people's pocketbooks, but also culturally and socially. And it's all of a piece, I think. Just to return to the thread of argument, the balkanizing effect of just too much choice and proliferation. And then on the flip side, to a growth in the size of government, because you have to start recognizing all of these different choices as equal. And some might say, just leave them alone. But really, it doesn't fit with the classical liberal emphasis on the importance of human dignity in their choices and freedom. You have to somewhat substantively, or at least ensure comparative standards of living for all these different types of people and ways of life. And this obviously is done through increasing size of state and redistribution. And so I don't think this is some sort of product of socialism or socialist type thinking. I think this is where classical liberalism ends. It requires a proliferation of choices, and they have to be supported. This both disintegrates unity in society and requires a bigger state to continuously redistribute. And we've seen that around the Western world, like states are just getting bigger over time. Some of the affordability challenges you've mentioned, they come, yes, from an excess of ideology, but really some of the features are endemic to it. Like the idea that immigration, we've been relying more and more on immigration, and we've had cratering fertility because the classical liberal viewed, again, it's very thin, as you said. I choose my way, and so I just need to keep maximizing choice. I think the effects of this are people, just working more and more. Two-parent families or two-income homes. So there's a lot of movement and churn at all times. It's led to declining fertility. It's led to higher and higher immigration.
Now I feel bad for cutting you off last time. No, I don't feel bad for cutting you off this time, but the last time I did feel bad because that was a brilliant line of thinking. You said, as we look at all choices as being equal, this leads to a proliferation of choices and emphasis on rights, which necessitates a larger state to enforce or realize those choices, make them real in society. And you use the word ends, which is a trigger word right now in political circles. Ends. Oh no, is he talking about post-liberalism? And I love a lot of the writing in that area. So I wanted you to expand on this idea of ends. And really, you've laid out an internal contradiction within the very ideas of classical liberalism. Now, you and I both love classical liberalism. At least I think we do. Yeah. And so can it be rescued from this internal contradiction? Or I think Marx said capitalism has the seeds of its own destruction, or contains the seeds of its own destruction, right? So can you dilate on the idea of liberalism ends and what do you mean by that, and whether or not we can overcome this internal contradiction given the state of society today, right now?
Yeah, great question. So I was using ends in connection to this idea that humans have a nature, we have ends. Those are both at the individual level of flourishing and the social level. And a lot of the things I was mentioning as parts of the problem, I think it really aligns with common sense very clearly that, people don't just need endless choice and movement around and economic opportunity. We need shared values. Our highest form of life is deep commitments and bonds and friendships and, somewhat thick cultural connections. And so all of these things are left out of the equation. So you mentioned fusion earlier, and that's interesting because, yes, this was this fusion between the libertarians and more the traditional conservatives, where it basically said that there's going to be alignment because the of the left who wants to utilize the state for refashioning of society and have an even more, let's say, relativistic understanding of morality and what's good for people. There was alignment there because they had so much power that the traditionalist conservatives who maybe had thicker views about how culture should be and in shaping institutions a certain way that the libertarians and classical liberals are less comfortable with. There was agreement because the conservative project was on reducing the size of the state, and maybe through things like school choice and more mixed models of delivery and these sorts of things, you could live out your little way of life with your community, right? And not be bothered and not have various ideologies kind of shoved down your throat at school or university or a business place. But I wonder if it can hold up, because we're at this point now where I think society is much different. The world is much smaller in many respects. I think a lot of people, I'm still certainly a believer, and I've done this in my own life, like retreat a little bit and find your own community and kind of foster that. There's still going to be a lot of that. We start seeing it in online forms of community, the podcast movement, all of these sorts of things. People increasingly distrust and are dissatisfied with what they get from media, universities, education.
I wanted to circle back again, backing up to a comment you made just a few moments before. You mentioned this leads to a larger state, immigration, decreased fertility, and I'm wondering if you could tie that back together to, you mentioned equality of choices. Every choice is the same no matter what. And it seems to me that the idea of liberalism itself as a political philosophy seems to make humans a fungible commodity. They're just meat Legos, using Mary Harrington's word from the UK. So as long as they get a job, we don't care about anything else. Now, am I overstating it, or is that an inherent outcome of our emphasis on maximizing freedom and choice? And is there any way to prevent this Legoization of humans in society?
Sean, I think I might have to get into philosophy a little bit here, away from political philosophy proper, because you're right that this view has to a conception of society and of people as one that's more mechanistic. They're just parts that can be rearranged. And ultimately, this is built on deeper philosophy of science and metaphysics that changed in the end of the Middle Ages into the period of the Enlightenment. There's a story that says, just looking at the history of ideas, that nominalism was a view that arose. William of Ockham and some of the scholastics basically said all concepts are just nominal and they don't have any reality to them. And I think from there to the view that everything is just reducible to material parts, you get this slow, steady development wherein we view human nature and society as a mechanism that can be kind of infinitely rearranged, and there's no inherent value, or even the nature of things it's not dependent in some way on how people are from conception, you could say, or any kind of thick human nature. And so this is behind it in many respects. And there's certainly another philosophical tradition here that views people as not as just collections of parts. The Thomistic tradition, Aristotle, that is, I think, definitely seeing a revival in secular circles as well as religious ones.
So a brilliant answer. Do you think the ideas that you've just shared now are representative of the Conservative Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Ontario, any of our leaders? Or are we just so far down a rabbit hole that, no, this only applies to a few bookish people like you and me? Or are these ideas that the average voter should know? And is there a way that we can link them to policy ideas and make them part of our understanding of Canada?
Great question. So on the one hand, yes, certainly the way I presented it was overly intellectual and philosophical. So yes and no to your answer. I think I'll talk about what's going on in the US right now. I think it's unfortunate that someone like Trump is the vehicle for breaking through a lot of the stagnant kind of centrist neoliberal paradigm in a really sometimes ugly way. He's also doing things that, I mean, they're not really his idea, some of them. They've been building up for some decades. I wouldn't call them just post-liberal as though they're 19th century romanticism revitalized. It's definitely not that. But there's a big intellectual movement that's been going on for some time in the Anglosphere that recognizes the limits to trade, the importance of thicker community, things like the natural law, family, community, a larger role for the state, anchoring in the Judeo-Christian perspective of the world. Undoubtedly, a large part of the movement is referring to that. And so I think on the one hand, yeah, some of the conceptual background and thinking behind some of this is not shared by the public, but I think people are definitely searching for a lot of these things. People want a lot of these things. They want family, they want stability, they want a home, a place that they can belong to. They want meaning in their life and an overarching worldview that kind of explains that. They want their kids to live somewhere. All of these things are lacking, and I would say even undermined by the overemphasis on aspects of the current paradigm. And it's no wonder that we're seeing a shift towards new types of.
And are you seeing that in Canada?
Good question. Less so in Canada, I would say, but more so maybe the past 5-10 years. So in Canada, we're smaller as well. This is more like the United States, the United Kingdom. There's a lot of energy among younger generation thinkers, quite a few think tanks and interesting movements going on, like MLI, Cardis, the Hub. There's a lot of interest in these sorts of things. And some younger politicians, someone like Jamil Javani, who is pointing very directly some of these things. I think it takes time, for sure. Not to say that this is just the way to go, but it's a school of thought and raising important questions and consideration.
So I share your sense of hope, enthusiasm that things are starting to change, and we're starting to realize that maybe we need to put language to some of these things that we used to just assume, and so we could live off of a very thin political philosophy. I'm wondering, to what extent do the idea-generating people on the right in Canada still hang on to that very thin view? And with that, it seems to paint us into a corner of saying, okay, you just give us the reins and we'll run the state better. But it seems to me that in so many ways, we don't really have different ideas.
I certainly...
I'm trying to get you in trouble.
Yeah, great advancements and progress that has been made under this kind of regime. And I think there's an overemphasis. Yes, undoubtedly, I think there's too much focus on this. It's not going to... It may make a dent. When you really look around, there's hardly an alternative vision. Like I sometimes say, conservatism in Canada, it's like liberalism, but 10 years behind. There are different speeds or something like that. And yes, there is still using the same recipe on these issues, but I think with time, that will change.
So you're hearing the word populism, and the shift has been towards a populist view of politics. What is your sense of that word? If there's a shift in conservatism, and I think there is, what do we make of the more populist feeling to it? And you mentioned the U.S. Do you have any sense of that in the Canadian scene?
First of all, populism is a historical phenomenon. It's not new. I think it describes, although I don't have the kind of definition top of mind, It describes, kind of a reaction or dissatisfaction from a large underserved part of the population reacting against the perceived or real failings of an elite class. We've discussed how the elite class in Western societies, I would say so generally, is more or less the same, liberal and conservative, different speeds, right? It's economic opportunities, choice, immigration, freedom, all of these sorts of things. And there is a reaction against it right now. People are dissatisfied with the values that they're seeing represented in society and on their economic situation. And so populism just means, I think, reaction against an out of touch. Yes, but it's fueling actions on the left and right. I think it's healthy, though. There's been a long march through the institutions from the 60s onwards, emphasize, and thus choice, independence, autonomy, economic way of life, high immigration, and permissiveness on the social side too, which I think is completely contrary to the moral order. People are fed up when they recognize this, and it's the populist reaction.
So you've said a couple things that make me feel uncomfortable, because you said it's a reaction against the elite class. And Peter, I think of you as an elite.
Yeah.
You're a philosopher, an international speaker. And so how do people like you and me maintain relevance to our friends and family, the average voter? Have you put your mind to that? Or
I'll return to the point about Trump, how it took someone like him to break through, because our natural inclinations can be towards comfort and going along to getting along and towing the line. And I think to an extent, everyone does that. And so even people who might criticize this, some of these things are still within the system and operate according to those principles, but it's a call to recognize and be humble and live up to your values a little more. I also think a lot of people who do hold these views, who are definitely within the elite strata just because of education or income, are nonetheless pursuing alternative social arrangements and lifestyles and this sort of thing. I would certainly count myself in that category to an extent. I went back to grad school to study philosophy because I was enamored by the pursuit of the good life and found contempt and mental illness, to be quite frank, among, let's call it the woke world, that is just everywhere. So I really thought I couldn't get a job in academia, and I went into politics for that reason. But and I also converted to Christianity. So it's quite the shift, but all because I kind of saw, to my mind, a lot of issues with this way of life, and many people are doing similar things, I would say. And I think the tide is shifting, and we're seeing signs of that now. People are less afraid to speak out on issues. And yeah, I think we see just more and more.
You presented a very shiny object for me when you talk about a change in life direction and philosophy and converting to Christianity. And that's a whole podcast on its own. So I don't want you to feel like I'm ignoring that, because that would be a discussion that hopefully we can have at another time if you're comfortable with going there. But I would like to circle way back to something that you mentioned. I wanted to get your thoughts on where do we go from here? What is Canada? Are we a post-nation state? What binds us together? Roger Scruton likes to use the phrase or talk about the pre-political. There needs to be something that holds us together. And Scruton would argue that a couple hundred years ago, it was religion that held England together. He said, now we've gone beyond that, and we need something else to hold us together. Have you thought about this with respect to Canada? What holds us together? Is it the flag? Is it the Governor General? Or do we need to find something else to hold us together? Are we a post-nation state?
Yeah, so I agree with you. Certainly these things did hold us together, and I really don't think they do any longer. I honestly believe that. I think it's beating an old drum, and I honestly don't know the answer to that question. The macro political level, in my own life, this is how I pursue it. It's through local community formation, and it's got to be ground up, because otherwise you are imposing, and there's complete elements of that. But maybe just to sketch some broad contours and then get into specifics, I always like to think of conservatism not as just incrementalism and doing what's worked and, this kind of process-based one, although those things are important as well because they're virtues, but of ideals and of, the perennial philosophy, as it's sometimes called. This is wisdom of tradition as tested through time, incrementalism to a point, but there's always this question of how much of the past can be conserved, especially in light of creeds that are potentially inimical to deeper tradition or even to human flourishing. As I mentioned before, people are looking for this sense of explanation, understanding, deeper forms of community, meaning, and for this to be anchored in something concrete. There's been proliferation of ideas and theories and a shrinking of the world, the availability of information technology. And this has really exploded people's conceptions and their worldviews. I think it's still going on. At the same time, I think it's sort of had a bit of an effect, and now we're seeing people separate the wheat from the chaff in small ways and form tighter-knit communities around elements of what I would call the perennial philosophy. And that's, maybe it's the Judeo-Christian tradition and natural law, more Aristotelian way of thinking about the natural world, which is, it's ordered, it's rational and understandable. Nature is directed towards certain ends, and that circumscribes how you're to live both individually and in community. Maybe I'll just start with that and see if you have any thoughts.
I wish conservative people in government like yourself and policy writers were more interested in that. I would like to know, is it just a massive educational opportunity that we have? Maybe Canada is it's like an all-inclusive resort and you can come here and work hard and pay taxes and that's all we care about.
I think our great strengths are in some ways derivative of that motto, peace, order, and good government. It's what makes Canada so attractive. We are very respectful people. We're very polite. We're peaceful. Canada was founded on a great agreement between very different peoples, the French and the English. And of course, we have a legacy of failed relations in many respects with First Nations. By and large, some of these things are our great strength. Those are significant virtues, and I think they're things to rally around. But I would say, and not to abstract away from Canada a bit, but it's because I think the answer is a bit the same for a lot of Western countries, including the United States. It seems like they have a lot more vigor and enthusiasm because they have a more ideological founding around freedom. But I think if you look deeper, there are tons of fissures. As everyone knows, polarization, they're teetering a bit. And my own answer is the Judeo-Christian worldview is the correct one. And you have to, in some ways, return to those roots. But I mentioned that conservatism of ideals and perennial philosophy because it's so lazy. It's never about just going back to the way things were done. That is absolutely nonsense. Ideals are only ever partially realized, and they were only very partially realized in Christendom. And there's much to build on. And so maybe just some things, a few comments there about Canada's own values, just to see what takes, and then ideally democratically people will choose to pursue what they find best. The highest aim in individual life and in political life is love, and the civic manifestation of that is the common good and life in common, and it's not the atomized individual. So this means forming bonds, building relationships, and sustaining them over time. This lifestyle of rootless autonomy required for this conception of modernity and endless consumption, it's really inimical to this deeper form of connection. And so I think people discover that through intellectual encounters or their own encounters with thicker, deeper traditions of thought and their manifestation in community. I think people will become open to that. I think talk about some of the unique features of the Christian worldview, the natural law, this idea that nature is circumscribed in some way, understanding that there are normative implications for us and how we ought to live, coupled with Christianity's great insights, the law of sacrifice and gift, self-giving charity and sacrifice, and childlike faith. There have been a lot of political revivals over time in Christendom that go back in some way to these roots, this wellspring.
So that's brilliant. Actually, I'm reading a book right now reviewing Roger Scruton's thoughts on the establishment of the church. And so those listeners who aren't familiar with Roger Scruton, he passed away just a few years ago. He said we needed a secular politics. He was actually very strong about not having anything to do with religion in our politics and in our lawmaking. But he was also very bullish on an established church for guiding culture. And this was even at a point when he would have described himself as a non-Christian, a cultural Christian at best, certainly not a man of faith. But he said one of the most important things he thought was a derivative of Christianity was this idea of penance or repentance, and just saying we're wrong and having that sort of general sense of humility as a core feature upon which to build a society. We're on pretty safe footing to talk about Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome as being pillars of our whole approach to arrive at getting peace, order, and good government. However, over the last few years, we've seen full protests in Toronto and Ottawa and people saying things that don't sound very peaceful at all. So I'm wondering, has Canada left behind those roots in Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome? Are we into a new phase where we need to maybe explain them over again?
Well, great question. I mean, Roger Scruton and, church and state and protest law. So first, yes, I think the unrest is endemic of a lot of these tensions you've mentioned. And the question, the tension between, an explicit philosophy, worldview, or religion and politics. I agree with you that they have separate spheres and there's a logic that governs them. It was in fact Christianity that pointed this out, not Enlightenment secular thinkers, which is, I think, lamentable. People think that because, of course, it says in the Bible, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and God what is God's. But of course, there needs to be an influence. And don't buy this thing of the neutral, like John Rawls's, all reasons must be neutral, public reasons. In many respects, you can boil religions down to other philosophies and worldviews, call them all the same. Their worldviews or their philosophies or their religions. So I think we need a much more explicit and healthier I guess, expression, explicitly religious ideas in politics and political sphere, but not, as you suggest, there needs to be balance. I would say the tensions that exist in society right now are from a lack of a unified society, which comes from too much immigration without integration, not enough common values and unity. Absolutely, I think that. And so the question is, because you were suggesting at one point, how do we get here, or how do we find unity around things? I think in many respects, the aspects of this, like the technocratic worldview that views people as just collection of parts, the way forward is just to manipulate things for ends, it completely divorces means from ends, as though any mean is legitimate, right? As long as you can fulfill some desire. You can increasingly manipulate your own body or pursue all sorts of methods to attain. There's nothing to unite people beyond a kind of boundless striving and using whatever means possible to attain some ill-defined conception of personal fulfillment or satisfaction. I think it's another thing that has a disintegrating effect on society and unity.
I guess the struggle for me is when we see the unrest in society, I feel burdened to say, hey, life could be so much better. We're not saying immigration per se is a bad thing. I don't think it is. And I think most Canadians support the concept, please come and integrate. So what are we integrating into? How can we join together? And it seems like, to use a word that you use, the common good, and that's something that I think about as well. We need to be able to craft a vision of the common good. I would like a positive vision to say, this is what we think of when we say peace. This is what we think of when we say order. Can we unite around trying to find the words to put meat on the bones of peace, order, and good government?
So I'll give a ideas-based answer and then one that's more practical or material. I'll start with the latter, actually. You mentioned immigration is a good thing. Absolutely agree. And integration is the key. So I think we need, and we're going to see this in decades to come, conservative parties around the world, it is a real slowing down on a lot of things. Trade, movement of peoples, immigration. Because sharing things in common, having shared values, spending time together takes time. And that's how you foster unity in some way from the perspective. Now, ideas-wise, I think there's great value in it's accessible by the light of natural reason, the natural law and virtue understanding of the person. We have a potential that can be fulfilled. As you mentioned, Brian Crowley's very fond of saying, you're not born a piano player, you need to cultivate it. There is something inherent that can be brought out, and it's only certain things that you do that will make you develop those skills and abilities and virtues that will allow you to be truly happy. And these things are not the very thin, Socratic, hyper-liberal conception, which just says, do whatever you want, choose a lot, discover yourself, whatever. The very specific things like learning to treat other people well, to be respectful, to be reverent. We've totally lost reverence. Reverence is so important. Respect your elders. Be charitable. Be giving. All of these things. There is a very well-developed school of thought around how to live the virtues well individually and in community with other people. And that's what makes, I think, a really attractive life. And people will want to be a part of that in small ways. And then again, I hope it will take on more so at the societal level. But I'm certainly glad to have found that in small ways in my own life and to be pursuing that.
I wonder if we should just close the show on that comment. I love the way you wrap that together, and that's certainly a positive point to end the podcast on. But I wanted to know before you go, if you're reading any books right now, and then also where to find more that Peter Copeland is doing. Tell us about your website or whatever else you're doing.
Sure. I have too many books on the go at all times, but I guess there are worse problems. Yeah, so I'm very interested in and involved with the Society of Catholic Scientists here in Toronto as their president. I'm very interested in philosophy of science and understanding differences in worldview in that regard. And so I'm reading some books on Aristotelian philosophy of nature, on quantum mechanics, and how it is in fact, kind of suggests in any way the Aristotelian division of the world between potency, matter, and form in a much better way than classical physics.
And where do we find your work?
You can find my work at Macdonald-Laurier's website or which is .com.
Is there anything else you wanted to say before we end?
Thanks so much for having me, Sean. We covered a lot of ground, and yeah, I hope I sounded hopeful because I certainly am, in spite of the kind of criticism of society at a macro level. There's a lot of really exciting things happening right now, and I would encourage people to look at them and take them up in small ways.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.